I didn't know my marriage was already ending the day I said yes to the dress. I remember standing in front of the mirror at the bridal boutique, my hands resting on my stomach, not because I was nervous, but because something inside me felt strangely hollow. The satin was smooth and cold against my skin, the saleswoman was smiling too brightly, and my future mother-in-law sat quietly on the couch behind me, her legs crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't say, "You look beautiful." She just nodded once and said, "That'll do." At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Weddings make people strange, I thought. Stress does funny things. I had no idea that while I was choosing flowers and tasting cake samples, she was already planning how it would all fall apart. Before all of that, before lawyers and documents and quiet betrayals, I believed I was building a solid, ordinary life. I met Daniel at work. Nothing dramatic. No sparks flying across a crowded room. He was steady, polite, a little reserved. The kind of man who remembered your coffee order and held doors open without making a show of it. After a few failed relationships, his calm felt like safety. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. 3 years of Sunday grocery shopping, burnt toast mornings, shared playlists on long drives. 3 years of learning each other's habits, his habit of tapping the steering wheel when anxious, mine of folding laundry into neat piles I never put away. When he proposed, it was quiet. No crowd. No ring box hidden in dessert. Just the two of us in our small apartment, the smell of tomato sauce still hanging in the air. "I don't want fireworks," he said, holding my hands. "I want forever." I said yes without hesitation. His mother, Margaret, was complicated. She was polite in the way that keeps you at arm's length. Always well-dressed, always composed. She asked questions about my job, my parents, my plans, but never quite listened to the answers. When she hugged me, it was brief, like a formality she'd rather skip. Daniel brushed it off. "That's just how she is," he'd say. "She's protective." That word did a lot of work. Margaret had raised Daniel alone after his father left when he was 12. She built her life around him, his school schedules, his sports, his future. He was her anchor, her proof that she had done something right. I understood that. Or at least, I thought I did. When we announced our engagement, she congratulated us with a tight smile and immediately asked about the prenup. "I'm not saying you need one," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "I'm just saying, it's practical." The spoon clinked softly against the cup. Once. Twice. Too loud in the silence. Daniel laughed it off. I did too. But something about the way she watched me, like she was measuring me, made my skin prickle. Still, life moved forward. Wedding planning filled our evenings. I argued with florists about shades of white. Daniel worried about seating charts. Margaret insisted on inviting distant relatives I had never met. "She's family," she'd say firmly. "And family matters." Sometimes she'd call Daniel late at night, her voice low and urgent, stepping into another room to talk. When I asked what it was about, he'd shrug. "Just mom stuff." I didn't push. I trusted him. I trusted us. The first real crack came 6 months before the wedding. Margaret invited me to lunch. Just me. No Daniel. Her house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Everything was in its place. Not a single item out of alignment. She poured tea, sat across from me, and folded her hands neatly on the table. "I want to talk to you woman to woman," she said. That phrase should have warned me. She asked about my childhood. My parents' divorce. My mother's second marriage. She nodded sympathetically, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You've seen how marriages can fail," she said softly. "That gives you perspective." I smiled politely. "It does." She paused, then said, "And you understand that love isn't always enough." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. I believe in working through things, I replied. She leaned back, studying me like a puzzle. We'll see. I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. After that lunch, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. Margaret became more involved. Too involved. She offered to help with legal paperwork for the wedding venue. She suggested we keep certain finances separate, just in case. She asked Daniel pointed questions about our disagreements, small ones, insignificant ones, and treated them like warning signs. Everyone rushes into marriage, she'd say. It's good to be realistic. I started noticing little things. Daniel hesitating before answering her calls. The way he'd repeat her phrases when we argued. She's just being practical, he'd say. We need to think long-term. Marriage doesn't guarantee permanence. Those words didn't sound like him. A month before the wedding, I found an envelope on the kitchen counter. It wasn't sealed. My name wasn't on it. Inside were copies of legal documents. Divorce mediation pamphlets. Contact information for a family lawyer. A checklist titled, Steps to Take If Marriage Becomes Unsustainable. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was a name. Margaret. I stood there for a long time, the refrigerator humming behind me, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A misunderstanding. Something reasonable. But deep down, a cold truth was beginning to form. She wasn't preparing for my marriage. She was preparing for its end. And I was about to walk down an aisle completely unaware that my future had already been drafted, without my consent. After I found the envelope, I didn't say anything right away. I wish I could tell you it was strength or patience that kept me quiet, but the truth is simpler, and harder to admit. I was afraid. Afraid that if I spoke too soon, I'd sound paranoid. Afraid that if I was wrong, I'd crack something fragile that didn't need breaking. So I put the papers back exactly where I found them. I smoothed the envelope flat. I wiped my fingerprints from the counter. Then I went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub until the shaking passed. That night, Daniel came home late. He smelled like cold air and coffee. He kissed my forehead, asked how my day was, and talked about work like everything was normal. I watched his mouth move while my mind replayed Margaret's handwriting. I almost asked him then. Almost. Instead, I said nothing. The days that followed felt heavier, like the air in our apartment had thickened. We moved around each other carefully, smiling when we were supposed to, laughing at the right moments. Wedding invitations went out. My dress hung in the spare room, wrapped in plastic, waiting. Margaret called more often. Sometimes she asked about the florist. Other times, she asked questions that felt angled. Have you two talked about expectations? Do you agree on finances? Daniel's always been sensitive. How do you handle conflict? Her voice was calm, reasonable. If you didn't listen closely, you'd miss the sharpness underneath. I began to notice how she framed things. She never said if something went wrong, only when. When you disagree. When you're unhappy. When things change. It was like she was planting seeds in dry soil, confident they'd grow. Daniel started repeating her language without realizing it. One evening, we argued about something small, whose turn it was to visit my parents for the holidays. Nothing serious. The kind of disagreement couples resolve in minutes. But Daniel sighed heavily and said, "This is what I mean. These little things add up. Mom says they're warning signs." I stared at him. Warning signs of what? He rubbed his face, suddenly tired. Of resentment. Of things not lasting. Not lasting. I felt something drop in my stomach. Do you feel that way? I asked quietly. He hesitated. Just a beat too long. I don't know, he said. I just think it's smart to be realistic. That night, I lay awake listening to the ticking clock on the wall. Each second felt loud, deliberate. Like time itself was counting down to something I couldn't see. I started paying closer attention. Margaret sent Daniel articles about divorce rates. She suggested premarital counseling to uncover incompatibilities. She forwarded him legal advice links for awareness. Another word that did too much work. I tried to talk to her once. Carefully. Politely. We were in her kitchen, the smell of simmering soup filling the room. She handed me a bowl and smiled, thin, practiced. I found some paperwork the other day, I said lightly. Legal documents. Divorce-related. She didn't flinch. Not even a blink. Yes, she said, sitting down. I like to be prepared. For what? I asked. She folded her napkin slowly. For reality. I swallowed. It felt premature. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. Marriage isn't a fairy tale, she said. Love fades. People change. I've seen it. I know marriages can fail, I replied. But planning for divorce before the wedding. She cut me off gently. Is wisdom. The word landed between us like a closed door. I'm protecting my son, she added. I hope you understand. Protecting him, from me. I left her house with my chest tight and my thoughts tangled. I wanted to believe she was just cautious. A mother who had been hurt before. But something about her certainty unsettled me. It wasn't fear I saw in her. It was confidence. The week before the wedding, I received an email meant for Daniel. It was forwarded by mistake. Or maybe not. The subject line read, "Post-wedding steps." My hands went cold as I opened it. It was from a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a family law attorney Margaret had mentioned casually months earlier. The email outlined timelines. Asset documentation. Contingency planning. There was even a note about keeping communication records, in case mediation becomes necessary. All dated to begin after the honeymoon. I sat there, the glow of my laptop lighting up the dark room, feeling like the ground beneath me was slowly, silently cracking. This wasn't abstract preparation. This was a plan. I confronted Daniel the next morning. He looked startled when I showed him the email. Truly startled. His confusion seemed real. I didn't ask for this, he said quickly. I swear. Then why does she think she needs it? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. She worries. You know how she is. No, I said softly. I'm starting to realize I don't. He promised to talk to her. He promised things would change. He promised that once we were married, boundaries would be clearer. I wanted to believe him. The wedding went ahead as planned. I walked down the aisle smiling, my heart pounding, not with joy, but with dread I couldn't explain to anyone else. Margaret sat in the front row, composed, watching me with that same unreadable expression. When Daniel said his vows, his voice trembled. When I said mine, my throat tightened around words I had once spoken with certainty. At the reception, Margaret hugged me. Welcome to the family, she said. Her voice was warm. Her grip was not. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how something so carefully dismantled could still look whole from the outside. I didn't know it yet, but the real betrayal hadn't happened. It was still coming. And when it arrived, it would leave no room for doubt. Marriage didn't change things the way Daniel promised it would. If anything, it sharpened them. In the first weeks after the wedding, our apartment felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in while we were gone. We unpacked gifts, wrote thank you notes, slid back into routines. From the outside, we looked newly married, easy laughter, shared dinners, photographs still framed on every surface. But underneath, something was misaligned. Margaret called every day during our honeymoon. Not to congratulate us or ask how we were enjoying ourselves, but to check in on Daniel. Is he sleeping well? Does he seem stressed? Marriage can be overwhelming at first. She never asked how I was. When we got back, the calls didn't slow down. They increased. Daniel would step into another room to answer. He started carrying his phone with him everywhere. When I asked what they talked about, he'd shrug. Just mom worrying. I wanted to trust him. I reminded myself that newly married life comes with adjustments. That I was tired. That I was overthinking. But then small things started happening. A joint account we had agreed to open together was delayed. Daniel said his mother suggested waiting until things stabilized. A vacation we planned was postponed because Margaret needed help with paperwork. A dinner with my parents was cut short because Daniel didn't feel up to it. He was pulling away in ways so subtle they were almost invisible. One evening, I came home early from work and heard voices in the living room. Daniel and Margaret. She had a key. I stood in the hallway, my coat still on, listening. You don't have to rush, she was saying. There's no shame in admitting a mistake. A pause. I just don't want you stuck, she continued. I've already spoken to someone. Just to understand your options. My heart pounded. Mom, Daniel said, his voice low. I married her. And you can unmarry her, Margaret replied calmly. People do it all the time. I stepped into the room. They both looked up, startled. Oh, Margaret said smoothly. You're home early. I nodded, forcing my voice steady. What options were you discussing? She smiled, unbothered. Marriage counseling. Legal advice. Practical things. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, we argued for the first time as husband and wife. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Carefully. Like we were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. I feel like you're already halfway out the door, I told him. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then why does your mother have a lawyer on standby? He rubbed his temples. She's just preparing. For what? I asked. For us to fail? He didn't answer. The silence said enough. Days later, I received a message from an unknown number. You deserve to know what's happening. Attached were screenshots. Emails. Between Margaret and the lawyer. Detailed. Organized. Methodical. They discussed timelines, documentation, strategies. How to keep things amicable. How to encourage a mutual decision. How to ensure Daniel would retain stability. My name appeared only in reference to assets. Not once was I mentioned as a person. I felt sick. The betrayal wasn't just that she planned my divorce, it was that she did it with such certainty. As if my role in Daniel's life was temporary by design. I confronted her the next day. She didn't deny it. I wanted to protect my son, she said simply. You can't fault a mother for that. What about respecting his marriage? I asked, my voice shaking. You don't have to rush, she was saying. There's no shame in admitting a mistake. A pause. I just don't want you stuck, she continued. I've already spoken to someone. Just to understand your options. My heart pounded. Mom, Daniel said, his voice low. I married her. And you can unmarry her, Margaret replied calmly. People do it all the time. I stepped into the room. They both looked up, startled. Oh, Margaret said smoothly. You're home early. I nodded, forcing my voice steady. What options were you discussing? She smiled, unbothered. Marriage counseling. Legal advice. Practical things. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, we argued for the first time as husband and wife. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Carefully. Like we were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. I feel like you're already halfway out the door, I told him. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then why does your mother have a lawyer on standby? He rubbed his temples. She's just preparing. For what? I asked. For us to fail? He didn't answer. The silence said enough. Days later, I received a message from an unknown number. You deserve to know what's happening. Attached were screenshots. Emails. Between Margaret and the lawyer. Detailed. Organized. Methodical. They discussed timelines, documentation, strategies. How to keep things amicable. How to encourage a mutual decision. How to ensure Daniel would retain stability. My name appeared only in reference to assets. Not once was I mentioned as a person. I felt sick. The betrayal wasn't just that she planned my divorce, it was that she did it with such certainty. As if my role in Daniel's life was temporary by design. I confronted her the next day. She didn't deny it. I wanted to protect my son, she said simply. You can't fault a mother for that. What about respecting his marriage? I asked, my voice shaking. She tilted her head. Respect is earned. Something in me hardened. That night, Daniel admitted he'd known about the lawyer. Not at first, he said. But early enough. I didn't think she'd actually use it, he said. I thought it would make her feel better. And how did it make you feel? I asked. He looked down. Conflicted. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just Margaret's plan. It was enabled by his silence. I moved into the spare room that night. Not out of anger, but clarity. Over the next few weeks, I watched as the plan unfolded exactly as she'd designed it. Margaret began pointing out our differences to Daniel. Encouraging distance. Suggesting trial separations, to gain perspective. She framed every disagreement as proof. And Daniel listened. The final blow came when I found a drafted separation agreement on his laptop. Not sent. Not signed. But ready. Dated 3 months after the wedding. I sat there, staring at the screen, my reflection faint in the glass. I felt foolish. Angry. Small. But beneath it all, something else was growing. Resolve. If she thought she could script my ending without me, I was about to rewrite it that I didn't confront Daniel right away after I found the draft. I closed the laptop carefully, the way you close a door in a quiet house so no one hears you leave. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and taken away. That document wasn't just a plan. It was proof. Proof that while I was still trying to save a marriage, they were already negotiating its remains. For 2 days, I moved through life as if underwater. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at people who had no idea my world was quietly collapsing. At night, I lay in the spare room staring at the ceiling, listening to Daniel move around on the other side of the wall. Sometimes he paused outside the door, as if he might knock. He never did. On the 3rd night, I asked him to sit down with me. The living room was dim, lit only by the lamp near the couch. The clock ticked loudly. I remember noticing how dusty the bookshelf looked, how ordinary everything felt for a moment that would change my life. I saw the separation agreement, I said. He didn't pretend not to know what I meant. His shoulders slumped. He sat down slowly, like a man preparing for impact. It wasn't final, he said. It was just something Mom suggested I look at. Suggested? I repeated. Daniel, it's dated. It's detailed. It names assets we haven't even fully discussed yet. He rubbed his face, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to stop her. That hurt more than anger would have. You didn't try, I said. He looked up then, eyes glossy. She said she was protecting me. She said if things went wrong, I'd be unprepared. And what did you think? I asked. He hesitated. That pause, that tiny space of silence, told me everything. I thought, maybe she was right, he said finally. I felt something inside me go very still. So you married me, I said slowly, while considering how to leave me. He didn't answer. I stood up, my legs shaking. Do you know what that feels like? To realize you were someone else's contingency plan? I never meant to hurt you, he said. But you did, I replied. And you let her do it too. The next day, I asked Margaret to meet me. Alone. We sat in the same kitchen where she'd once spoken about wisdom and reality. The soup pot wasn't on the stove this time. The house felt colder. I know everything, I said. She nodded. I assumed you would, eventually. No shame. No apology. Why? I asked. Why go through with the wedding at all? She folded her hands, just as she always did. Because people need to see for themselves. I wanted Daniel to be certain. Certain of what? I asked. That you weren't right for him. The words were calm. Matter of fact. Cruel in their simplicity. You decided that before you even knew me, I said. She shrugged slightly. I knew enough. And what about what he wants? I asked. She smiled then. A small, sad smile. He's always trusted my judgment. That was when I understood the full scope of the betrayal. This wasn't just a mother interfering. This was a woman who had never intended to let go. I left her house without raising my voice, without slamming a door. I walked out with my back straight and my heart in pieces. That evening, I packed a bag. Daniel watched from the doorway, silent, pale. I need space, I told him. From both of you. Is this a separation? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment. I think you already decided that. I stayed with a friend for a week. Then too. During that time, Margaret's plan accelerated. She began calling Daniel constantly. She suggested counseling sessions she had already researched, sessions framed around amicable separation. She sent him articles about knowing when to let go. And she called me once. I hope you're being reasonable, she said. I laughed then. A short, bitter sound. You don't get to define reason anymore. That was when I made my decision. If she wanted a quiet, controlled ending, she wasn't going to get it. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I consulted my own lawyer. I gathered documentation. Messages. Emails. Timelines. And then, when everything was in place, I asked Daniel to meet me. One last time. We sat across from each other in a neutral space, a small cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and cinnamon. He looked tired. Older. I'm not here to fight, I said. I'm here to tell you what's going to happen. He listened. I told him I was filing for divorce. On my terms. With full transparency. I told him I would not be painted as unstable, difficult, or unreasonable. And your mother, I added quietly, will no longer be the narrator of my life. He closed his eyes. I should have stopped her, he said. Yes, I replied. You should have. That was the last honest conversation we ever had. Once I decided to act, something inside me settled. Not peace, yet. But clarity. The kind that comes when you stop asking why and start asking what now. I stopped responding to Margaret's calls. I blocked her number after the third voicemail that began with, "I'm only trying to help." I told my lawyer everything, showed her the emails, the drafts, the timelines that proved this wasn't a sudden breakdown but a slow, deliberate construction. She listened carefully, her pen moving in small, precise strokes. "This isn't just interference," she said finally. This is orchestration. That word stuck with me. Orchestration implies control. Intention. A conductor guiding every note. For weeks, I lived out of 2 suitcases at my friend's house. Her guest room smelled faintly of lavender. At night, we drank tea and watched mindless television, and she never pushed me to talk. She let the silence do its work. Daniel sent messages at first. Long ones. Apologetic ones. Messages filled with regret but still softened with excuses. She didn't mean it this way. She just worries too much. I didn't know how to stand up to her. I read them all. I answered none. Instead, I focused on preparing for what came next. Margaret wanted control. Privacy. A clean narrative. I wasn't interested in revenge, but I was interested in truth. The first step was family. I asked Daniel's sister, Claire, to meet me. She'd always been polite, distant, orbiting her mother like a cautious moon. We met at a park, the sound of children playing somewhere behind us. I need you to hear this from me, I said. She listened. Her face shifted from confusion to disbelief to something like grief. She did what? She asked. I showed her the emails. She pressed her lips together. She's done this before, she admitted quietly. With my brother's college girlfriend. With Dad, too, in her own way. That hurt, but it also confirmed something important. This wasn't about me. It never had been. Next came the public layer. Margaret had always curated her image carefully. The devoted mother. The wise advisor. The woman who just wanted the best. I didn't tear that image down. I let it crack. When Daniel's extended family asked why I'd moved out so suddenly, I didn't gossip. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth. Calmly. Simply. Margaret arranged legal preparations for my divorce before I married her son, I said. And Daniel knew. No embellishment. No anger. Just facts. The reactions were quiet, but powerful. Silence at dinners. Awkward pauses on phone calls. People asking careful follow-up questions Margaret couldn't easily deflect. She tried, of course. She framed me as emotional. Unstable. Overwhelmed by marriage. But this time, she didn't control the evidence. The final confrontation wasn't planned. It happened at a family gathering I hadn't even intended to attend. I went because I refused to disappear. Margaret saw me across the room. Her smile froze. We stood facing each other near the window, the hum of conversation filling the space between us. I didn't expect you, she said. I'm done accommodating expectations, I replied. Her voice dropped. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I met her gaze. You made it impossible from the start. People were watching now. Not openly, but attentively. I only wanted to protect my son, she said. And in doing so, I replied evenly, you destroyed his marriage. A murmur rippled through the room. She flushed, anger flashing across her composed face for the first time. You think you've won something? I shook my head. This isn't about winning. It's about being honest. I walked away before she could respond. That was the moment the power shifted. The divorce itself was quiet. No courtroom drama. No raised voices. But Margaret wasn't involved. That was the difference. Daniel tried once more to reconcile. To promise boundaries. Change. I see it now, he said. I see what she did. I believed him. But belief wasn't enough anymore. I needed a partner, I told him gently. Not someone learning too late. When the papers were signed, I felt grief, but also relief. Like setting down a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. Margaret didn't attend the final meeting. I heard later that she was furious. That she felt humiliated. That she told people she'd been misunderstood. For the first time, it didn't matter. Because her plan, so carefully laid, so confidently executed, had failed in the one way she never anticipated. I hadn't played my assigned role. After the divorce was finalized, I expected quiet. I imagined my life shrinking down to essentials: work, sleep, small routines stitched together with patience. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The real consequences didn't arrive with shouting or scandal. They arrived slowly, through pauses in conversations, through invitations that didn't come, through the subtle shift of how people looked at Margaret when she entered a room. Truth has a way of changing the temperature. At first, Margaret tried to maintain control. She called family meetings I didn't attend. She spoke in carefully chosen phrases: misunderstandings, emotional strain, young marriages sometimes struggle. She never said my name directly. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. But the problem with long-term manipulation is this: it leaves a trail. People began comparing stories. An aunt mentioned how Margaret had discouraged her from remarrying after her divorce. A cousin remembered how she'd interfered in his relationship years earlier. Claire, quiet, steady Claire, started asking questions out loud instead of swallowing them. Patterns emerged. And once people see a pattern, they can't unsee it. I noticed it at a family event months later. I'd been invited by Daniel's cousin, unsure whether I should go. In the end, I decided I would, not to provoke, but to prove to myself that I didn't need to hide. Margaret was there. She stood near the kitchen, talking animatedly, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. But the circle around her was thinner than it used to be. Conversations drifted away instead of toward her. When she noticed me, her expression tightened, but she said nothing. For the first time, she had no script. Later that evening, someone asked her directly, "Did you really plan their divorce before the wedding?" The room went quiet. Margaret laughed lightly. That's a very dramatic way of putting it. But no one laughed with her. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth had already settled into the room like dust, fine, unavoidable. Daniel, too, faced his own reckoning. Friends who once envied his close relationship with his mother began questioning it. He lost more than a marriage. He lost the illusion that neutrality was harmless. "You should have chosen sooner," one friend told him. "Silence is a choice." He told me that later, during one of our last conversations. "I didn't know how to separate myself from her," he admitted. "Now I don't know who I am without that dynamic." I felt compassion for him. But compassion isn't the same as reconciliation. Margaret's reputation didn't collapse overnight. But it eroded. Slowly. Publicly. Irreversibly. She was no longer the unquestioned authority. Her advice was met with pauses, with polite nods instead of obedience. Invitations became conditional. Conversations shifted when she entered. Control thrives in silence. And silence was gone. Why I'd ignored early discomfort. Why I'd accepted emotional minimization as patience. Why I'd mistaken calm for safety. I learned something important there. Love without agency isn't love. It's compliance. Margaret faded into the background of my life. I heard things occasionally, through friends of friends. She'd taken up a new project. She was focusing on herself. She missed Daniel terribly. I didn't wish her harm. But I also didn't miss her. Daniel and I spoke once more, nearly a year after the divorce. We met by chance at a bookstore. He looked different. Less certain. More human. We talked about work. About the weather. About nothing that mattered. Then he said, "I'm learning how to say no." I smiled sadly. "I hope it's helping." "It is," he said. "I just wish I'd learned sooner." So did I. But regret is only useful if it changes something. And it had, just not the past. I dated again, eventually. Slowly. Carefully. I paid attention to how I felt in my body, whether my shoulders tensed, whether my voice softened too much. I learned to trust discomfort. The right person didn't feel like certainty. He felt like respect. When I told him about my marriage, he listened without interruption. He didn't defend anyone. He didn't offer solutions. He just said, "That must have been lonely." And I realized how rarely anyone had named that truth. I wasn't broken. I'd been outnumbered. As for Margaret, our paths never crossed again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about her. About how fear can masquerade as love. How control can disguise itself as care. I think about the cost of refusing to let others live their own lives. And I hope, quietly, that she learns something too. The last thing I packed from my old life was my wedding dress. I donated it. Not because I wanted to erase the memory, but because I didn't want it to own me. I kept something else instead. A letter I wrote to myself the night I found the separation agreement. It ends with this line. "You are not a draft. You are the final version." I read it whenever I forget that if you had asked me, back when I was standing in that bridal shop, smoothing white fabric over my hands, whether I would have walked away from my marriage, I would have said no without hesitation. I believed love meant endurance. I believed patience could outlast anything. I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, things would settle into place. I know better now. Some endings don't come from one explosive moment. They come from quiet decisions made without you, plans drawn in rooms you were never invited into. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight harder for a marriage. It's to step away from a story that was never truly yours to tell. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever felt managed instead of loved, planned around instead of partnered, I hope you remember this. You don't need permission to protect your peace. You don't need to be chosen after the fact. And you don't owe loyalty to anyone who treats your life like a contingency plan. I'm stronger now, not because I survived betrayal, but because I stopped negotiating my worth. Would you have gone through with the wedding if you had known what I knew? Or would you have walked away sooner? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing or supporting the channel, so more voices like this can be heard. You're not alone.